Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Studio Museum in Harlem. I am Henry Murphy. I'm a former fellow in the Public Programs and Community Engagement Department here. We're really ecstatic that you all have chosen to join us for today's talk, today being the intersection of several momentous occasions. Nationally, the day designated to the life and work and continued work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and all those both famed and forgotten who have been martyred in the fight for Black liberation. And in the life of the museum, as we enter our 50th year, it's a moment to celebrate the closing of our final season of exhibitions in this building, and celebrate the Studio Museum as it has existed since 1968 on Fifth Avenue, to this building, a former bank in the 1980s, to our near future in Harlem and our future home at this very spot. Perhaps there's no better moment to consider the politics of space, memory, and their intersections with Black life. This talk is presented in conjunction with their Own Harlems, an exhibition just outside the theater here, curated by our very own Connie Choi, which celebrates Jacob Lawrence's centennial, and is an examination of, examines the artist's relationships to Harlem and its specificities, but also the metaphors it allows for Black urban spaces. I want to thank my colleagues and friends in the Public Programs and Community Engagement Department for helping me organize this talk. Rachel Murillo, Anais Duplan, and Nico Whedon, thank you. And now for the folks we're here to hear speak, excuse me. First, I would like to introduce Professor Mabel O. Wilson, who teaches in the Architecture, History, and Design courses at Columbia GSAP. She is also appointed as Senior Fellow at the Institute for Research in African American Studies and co-directs the Global Africa Lab. Her design and scholarly research investigates space, politics, and cultural memory in Black America, race and modern architecture, new technologies, and the social production of space and visual culture in contemporary art, film, and new media. Her transdisciplinary practice, Studio Anne, has been a competition finalist for several important cultural institutions, including Lower Manhattan's African Burial Ground Memorial and the Smithsonian National Museum for African American History and Culture. Exhibitions of her work have been featured at the Wexner Center for the Arts, Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum Triennial, the Storefront for Art and Architecture, SF Camera Works. She is a founding member of Who Builds Your Architecture, an advocacy project to educate the architectural profession about the problems of globalization and labor. WBYA's work was featured in the 2014 Istanbul Design Biennial, and in 2011, she was honored as a United States Artist Ford Fellow in Architecture and Design. She's the author of Negro Building, Black Americans in the World Fairs and Museums, which was a runner-up for John Hope Franklin Prize for the Best American Studies publication in 2012. Her scholarly essays have appeared in numerous journals and books on critical geography, memory studies, art, and architecture. She has received awards, fellowships, and residencies from the Getty Research Institute, New York State Council for the Arts, and ID Magazine. For 2015-16, she was the Lisa Mellon Bruce Senior Fellow at the National Gallery of Art Center for Advanced Study in Visual Arts. She is currently developing the manuscript Building Race and Nation, How Slavery Influenced Antebellum American Civic Architecture, and collaborating on a collection of essays on race and modern architecture. So a moment for Professor Wilson, please. Next, I'd like to introduce American Artist. American Artist is an interdisciplinary artist whose work extends Black studies and organized labor discourse into the context of networked virtual life. Influenced by minimalist installation, artists such as Felix Gonzalez Torres and David Hammonds, artists manipulate existing materials and processes, smartphones, social media, for instance, to invoke critical thought around contemporary culture and technology. Their practice consists of video, installation, new media, and writing that embodies the Black radical imaginary. American artists born in 1989 in Altadena, California, changed their legal name as the basis of an ambivalent practice, one of declaration, by insisting on the visibility of Blackness as a description of American artists and erasure. Anonymity in virtual spaces where American artist is an anonymous name, unable to be Googled or validated by a computer as a person's name. Our artist is currently a resident at I-Beam, a year-long art and technology residency located in Brooklyn, New York. In 2016, they attended the Whitney Independent Study Program as an artist. They have exhibited at the Kitchen, the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts, and the Studio Museum in Harlem. They have participated in group shows internationally and published writing in the New Inquiry and New Criticals, as well as work featured in AQ&B, Hyperallergic, and Huffington Post. Artist is art director of the Arts and Politics publication Unbag and holds an MFA in Fine Arts from Parsons, the New School. Their first New York solo exhibition, Black Gooey Universe, opens January 26 at Housing Gallery in Bed-Stuy. So a moment for American, please. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Julie Mehretu. Julie Mehretu is a world-renowned painter born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1970, who lives and works in New York City and Berlin. She received a Master of Fine Arts with honors from the Rhode Island School of Design in 1997. Mehretu is a recipient of many awards, including the MacArthur Award in 2005 and the U.S. Department of State Medal of Arts Award in 2015. She is best known for her large scale of paintings that take abstract energy, topography, and sensibility of global urban landscapes and political unrest as a source of inspiration. She has shown her work extensively in international and national solo and group exhibitions and is represented in public and private collections around the world. Recent projects include completing 2 large-scale paintings for San Francisco Museum of Modern Art's Evelyn and Walter Haas, Junior Atrium in 2017, entitled Hal Eon 1-2. She's represented by Marion Goodman Gallery in New York. So a moment for Julie, please. So briefly, this conversation will be followed by a Q&A, after which we encourage you to take the last look of this last look weekend and enjoy the exhibitions upstairs. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to our curator and moderator, Connie Choi.
Hello? Great. Thank you again for everyone for being here on our last day in this building to the public. So first I'd like to just begin by asking our 3 panelists here what drew them to the city. What is it about the city, both as a specific place and as a larger cultural idea or understanding that has influenced their practice, and what it is specifically about the city as a location that they're interested in. Who wants to start?
Mabel. Put me on the hot seat. Thank you, Julie. No, it's actually great to see folks out there, and many faces I recognize. And the Studio Museum is a really important place for me, in the sense that as a kid, I remember coming quite a bit to New York to actually visit an aunt who lived not very far from here, my great aunt Susie, who migrated from North Carolina. I also have an uncle, John Outerbridge, who's an artist who has shown here a number of times, is also in the collection. And so, so I already had these kinds of connections and remembrances of of Harlem in particular and New York. And, I moved here in '86, and I've moved in and out of the city several times and lived elsewhere. But I'm always drawn back precisely because of the amazing kind of energy, creative and intellectual energy that's here. And the fact that the city is always changing, sometimes for good, sometimes for not so good. But for me, it's always been a magnet where I feel like I can do the kind of practice that really is meaningful both to me and hopefully to others.
Well, as you mentioned, the creative and intellectual energy of the neighborhood is really unmatched, and that's something that I think draws pretty much all of us to this neighborhood. Something you mentioned in leading up to this was the project I did for the Studio Museum for the Harlem postcard, which gave me a chance to actually directly engage with people within Harlem, because I don't live in Harlem. I moved to New York about 4 years ago, and I live in Flatbush in Brooklyn. But I think that there's a certain energy and a certain communal aspect in history and legacy, especially of Black people migrating through the U.S. and establishing a sort of like Mecca in Harlem that I think is still felt throughout the neighborhood, and you don't necessarily find the same kind of situation in other parts of New York still. So I find myself always coming back here and wanting to engage with the neighborhood even more.
I mean, I first moved here directly after college, and I think like there undoubtedly what both American and Mabel have mentioned are the reasons I think that attract all of us to New York, and Harlem. I mean, I was attracted to Harlem also for similar reasons, but I think it's also naivete. Like for me, like I was completely had this idea of how I could engage with and participate and have space in the city. And what's incredible is this city, it makes room for everybody and any individual. Within hours, you can be a New Yorker and you're part of the fabric of the city. And but it's also that's what keeps this city kind of constantly evolving and changing. Is that people are coming here every day with that same desire, drive, kind of desire for connection and the conversation here, the level of discourse, the kind of dynamism that happens in exchange here constantly elevates what can be thought of, just whether it's intellectual kind of discourse or what's happening when you're walking down the street and the type of interconnectedness that you have in this city. I've been to so many places and very few places have the kind of dynamic that occurs in New York. And Harlem in particular, like Harlem reigned, like the other day I was walking down the street and felt like I can't imagine another neighborhood that has the kind of vitality of this neighborhood. And so I moved to Harlem from Brooklyn, and I was living at the time that I could move back to the city. Had been living in New York for a while, but I moved back and I was out in Bushwick, and there was no one really in the area in Bushwick I was in, and I started the Studio Museum residency project, and I mean here being an artist in residence here, and then moved here into the neighborhood directly after that, for those reasons.
So maybe we can just expand on the idea of Harlem as a very specific place. American artist, you were talking about your Dignity series, and I have one of the images. This was actually the Harlem postcard from last year that was selected. So thinking maybe specifically about the project that you did here, the time you spent here, the interactions you had with the people here.
Sure. It was kind of a strange process because I tried to arrange, I guess, meetings with people who live in Harlem to try and have them show me personal images. The basis of the project is this idea of a dignity image, which is personal images that you kind of save, like in your phone or anything like that, kind of like digitized images that you don't share through social media or any sort of like public internet context where you kind of feel obligated to produce certain kinds of imagery. So the dignity image are those images you might have a photo of your family that doesn't quite fit that model of how you need to share yourself. So you keep it to yourself, but it still holds this important personal weight for you. And what I was doing with this series was finding people who would be willing to show me personal images on their phones that would fit this criteria, and letting me take a photo of them and ask them a little bit about it. And that's a strange thing to do, walking down the street, just asking people to show me their personal photos. But I did get a few people who were interested, and it was cool to hear, like what was the context of these images, or what was the content, and trying to kind of parse out how people kind of relate to Harlem. Like one woman, I think it's Olivia, she had just moved here a few months ago, and in this image you see like her friend just got engaged or something like that. And then on AJ's image, it's this kid who grew up here. He had been living here. He was like 17. And so it's like you have all of these people who kind of like have different experiences to Harlem, or how long they've been here, why they're here, or like what's their background for understanding how they relate to this city, which I think kind of like helped me also understand how I fit into that, as someone who like didn't grow up here. Yeah, so I think that was like an integral part of like trying to parse out what it is that Harlem is in this contemporary context.
Great. And Mabel, you work right down the street from us at Columbia, but you've also contributed to our Harlem World exhibition from 2004. You contributed an essay titled Black in Harlem, Race, Architecture, and the City. I'm trying to scroll through to your images. You also recently co-organized a series of performances called Marching On for Performa 17. Speak a little bit about those experiences.
Yeah, it was a really, I've never done worked on performance. I mean, I've danced as a kid, and so it was, for me, it was a sort of new kind of medium to work through. It was a collaboration with Brian E. Roberts, who's an interesting young designer, and we worked with an amazing drill team, the Marching Cobras, and you see them here, and their choreographer and director. And part of what I think Brian and I were interested in was the kind of question of why do African Americans have drill teams, a kind of military form, and what does that mean? And what we started to discover was also the importance not only of the parade, but also the ways in which public space were being appropriated, right? And so there was a kind of like doublespeak going on, I think, with the form itself of the march and of the drill team. And we were interested both in the question of military, but also militancy, and the question of seen and being seen, which is this kind of like camouflage that's also based on the pattern of the paving in that. And it was great to work with the Marching Cobras because we talked a lot about like the history of marching. The silent parade was one thing that we based the performance on, but also the Harlem Hellfighters, which was a regiment that actually fought in World War I, was distinguished and then came back to the same Jim Crow, ruthless segregation. And yet, within the streets of New York, they were able to kind of make a statement and draw African Americans out into the streets to say, wait a minute, we should have equal standing. So I think for the kids in the drill team, it was amazing to sort of hear that history and then to try to connect it to recent Black Lives Matters marches to recognize that this was a kind of long legacy of a way of appropriating public space and making political statements of resistance and refusal.
And Julie, as you mentioned, you moved here several years ago, over a decade ago now. What is it like to continue to live and work in Harlem and see how Harlem has changed and evolved over the time that you've been here?
Well, when I was an artist in residence here, it was then that I moved here, 2001. And there's been a lot of kind of change, incredible change in the neighborhood then. I mean, since I came, and I had been coming to, in fact, the mother of a close old friend of mine, from really when I first moved to New York, is here, and that's when I first started to come to Harlem. His place was on 116 in St. Nicholas. In fact, all these old paintings of mine I left with him. But that from that point until I came back, which that was in 1992, in 93, the neighborhood had evolved a lot and had changed a lot, but still was like nothing that it is today. And I think one of the most stark kind of dynamics of the neighborhood, or especially 125th Street at that time, which is where I really was engaging with the neighborhood before moving to 126th Street, was 125th Street. 125th Street, after it got dark, all the riot gates would come down in front of every storefront, and the whole street shifted in its dynamic. But all the neighborhoods, there were streets where the row houses people had been living here for a long time, and there were streets where you had an abandoned row house next to really beautifully maintained row house, and you had this very kind of eclectic mix. And then you had urban farms on Frederick Douglass, where you now have mega shops, and you had these urban farms, and you didn't have like the horrific forms of architecture that have really taken over and colonized the neighborhood in so many ways. And so you had this really weird form of development in this neighborhood, but it still has, to me, it's pretty intensely dynamic still. And while there's this intense erasure of the African presence, which is one of the big, like to me, that not just the kind of African American historic dynamic of this neighborhood, but this intensely West African or Ethiopian or Senegalese or South African dynamic that existed here. You felt that in particular neighborhoods, the Ivoirians and the Senegalese, and the external African market that was eventually closed by Giuliani. This dynamic that still is very present is disappearing. 116th Street, this is being erased. And that's to me kind of something that is devastating, but it's what happens to neighborhoods, and I understand that. But what has taken place here, what I find exciting, is under the leadership of Thelma Golden here at the Studio Museum, with the kind of establishment of other the kind of re-emergence of the Apollo in this very different dynamic from what happened with Mabel, the Mabel's Theater, and on St. Red Rooster. You have this very different kind of nodes of operation. Black Harlem, the Harlem Stage. These are doing different things in the community that has been going on, but there's this dynamic that's happening that's been kind of accelerating. And that crescendo that you feel in the neighborhood is you feel it everywhere when you're walking through the streets, and people feel it. And while the community is being gentrified and becoming a very kind of different dynamic community in a very different way, there's this kind of fierce, complex kind of important creativity that is kind of that doesn't stop. It's unrelenting, and that to me is really kind of inspiring still.
And resilience.
Resilience, yeah, that's the word I was looking for. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and to maybe go back to one of your ideas about the fact that this neighborhood is changing and so much and such. I think when you think about public spaces, you can't really think about them without thinking of the history of those spaces and the history of violence in those spaces particularly. And I know, Julie, you talk about this a lot when you talk about the American landscape and how you really can't separate the two. This idea that so much has happened in these spaces before we've been here, thinking about just even architecture of the spaces and what buildings have been raised and what new structures are coming in and how that's all tied to violence as well, but also the violence of memory and how we forget things over time, forget how these spaces have been used and who occupied those spaces. And so I don't know if maybe each of you want to talk a little bit about that idea of the history of violence, both on the architecture, the city, but also maybe on cultural memory too.
Mabel or American. This feels like your text. But I mean, I'll
Yeah, no, I mean, I think maybe to pick up some of the things that, Julie sort of mentioned about gentrification and the transformation, I think one of the reasons Brian and I were fascinated about Marcus Garvey Park was because, for one thing, there's that big boulder that didn't move. So the kind of pressure of the grid of the city to move northward, was thwarted literally by this natural outcropping, right? And yet the kind of power of development and urbanization and capitalism it's very violent. I mean, it literally can flatten a landscape, right? But one of the interesting things about Marcus Garvey Park was that there had traditionally been this drum circle there. And as the neighborhood has gentrified, there have been more and more complaints about the noise, so much so that there was sort of pushback. And it was like, no, this is a tradition. This is part of the history of the city. And so we were really interested in a way of the performance kind of reclaiming that space, right? We made a lot of racket, particularly even with our rehearsals, like at 7 o'clock at night. But there was a kind of pushback about, right, different ways of occupying space that aren't about, it being a kind of proper, silent, quiet play space, but other ways in which, kind of culture can unfold. But I do think there is something about modernity that already, are these acts of violence. I'll never forget my uncle John, kind of said once when he was talking about his work, he said, the Europeans came here, they scooped the earth up in the bucket and said, mine, right? That idea of turning land and into property is a very violent act of settlement and abstracting it into property. And so I think there's something about the kind of larger American project that kind of speaks to that. And so maybe that's where you can sort of talk about your own work.
Sure. Yeah, I would say my line of inquiry into, I guess, violence and cultural memory is not so directly based in like a city location, but like thinking about online space as a kind of like locale and something that's kind of like mutable and flexible and is also kind of up for grabs through like a capitalist construct, especially as we're seeing like net neutrality being taken away. I feel like that kind of symbolizes the internet kind of finally being recognized as like a substantial resource or something that's kind of maturing or fermenting. It's like the stamp on it to say now it's like a private institution or whatever. But I guess I'm thinking about how the way we communicate in these kind of networked spaces, being a space of like challenging these modes of violence or like voicing an alternative to that. And conveniently, this piece that's here is this piece called Sandy Speaks, and it was this chat bot that I developed, and it's kind of inspired by the legacy of Sandra Bland and her arrest and her death in prison. And essentially it's this chatbot that you can interact with to kind of query ideas around Sandra Bland's case and also the prison system and surveillance, and ask questions about that. I think there's like a video that should be in here after these images. It starts out like black. So Henry said if you like press next one more time, it should play. Yeah.
You do technology.
Yeah.
I do not do technology.
Okay, well, it would be like an interaction with the bot, but it's fine. Just put it on a still image. Back. Oh, cool.
We got it back there.
Okay, cool. So yeah, you could just let that play for a little bit, but yes, I'm thinking about how you can use these technologies that should be accessible and somewhat public to address these forms of systemic violence, or trying to create certain, I guess, radical or counter state services or practices like available, or an actual like conversation for people that might otherwise not have access to that.
And Julie, I didn't know if you wanted to expand.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Harlem, I mean, or in terms of what Mabel was talking about in terms of New York, I mean, so many of these row houses that are so celebrated and considered, we look at with a very kind of nostalgic lens, were from my understanding, were developmental kind of, they were what do you call it? Developers,
Speculative,
would build these row houses in mass, and so that's why when you drive down the street, you'd see many that look very similar. And this was way before anyone was really living up here, and it was a in that sense, it was a very much kind of futurist type of market. There's a word I'm thinking about that I can't come to, but in terms of my own work and the history of that violence, and kind of the history of who ended up here through happens after that, but I think kind of our in terms of our cultural memory, what Harlem is super interesting, because it is kind of in many ways the vestiges of this container of like the memory of that in many ways, as well as being a site of incredible violence for different reasons. But in terms of what I was thinking about recently with my work for San Francisco, and this also touches a little bit on what you're talking about in terms of that space. But for me, a lot of what happened in the last year and the year before brought up a lot of kind of cultural memory in terms of, or kind of felt like it reinvigorated this type of the kind of understanding of what took place and what was coming to the surface and bubbling up again through the election of the 45th president, and then the dynamic of the campaign and what took place in the campaign, and the horror of the reality of that election and what that kind of meant, and the symbolism of that. And I was working on these paintings, these big paintings during that moment, and San Francisco, and I wanted to really deal with San Francisco as a site, because that was where these. So for me, going back to early, like when San Francisco first became something, as a kind of edge town on the Pacific, the kind of this point of kind of larger American project of American westward expansionism, and in that, at the same time as this drive was taking place, and around that same time, you were having this drive for emancipation. You were having the kind of incredibly horrific genocidal project that was eradicating Native communities and culture in this context, while at the same time, just a few years, and I mean 10, 20 years later, you had the kind of effort for protectionism of these national state parks, and the first efforts of that through art projects and through photographers and through these. So there's all this kind of the mesh of all of that, and what that project of manifest destiny, and kind of with the gold rush, and what the establishment of this city and what it was in many, many ways, the kind of collective history of that site, I started to think about in terms of, because of the location of where these paintings would be. And in many ways, while that was happening, this was, like I said, before emancipation. And so this was at a moment of a very different dynamic in American history, and in these drives to shifting this country. And in that, there's this incredible, all of those are these incredibly violent kind of dynamics that are taking place. And much of that work that deals with that landscape is about a very different type of sublime American landscape painting, and from the Hudson River Valley School all the way to the kind of the paintings being made of the Great West. And so for me, and then if you think about land art, kind of the land art projects of the 60s, 70s, 50s, 60s, 60s, 70s, you have this other very kind of deracialized, depoliticized, this kind of empty landscape where this work just exists in its pure relationship to the ground, and it's very formal dynamic, which again just erases any kind of cultural memory or cultural dynamic in that. So I was thinking about all of that in the making of those paintings and citing it there, but also how much that is being repeated in San Francisco and Silicon Valley as kind of the developers of this infrastructure of this new landscape, this kind of internet landscape. Yeah, I'm sorry?
I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah, and that's those same dynamics are taking place now within that landscape, where individuals, where we become products or are products in a different way, where and so the dynamics are. I mean, I think it's really fascinating, your work and how you're approaching that. But those same dynamics are at play. So for me, they're kind of interconnected in that, and I was interested in that as a part of that history. But I think that applies right here too. I mean, without going into that.
Oh yeah, just outside. If you look at what's happening on 125th Street, just all the changes that are happening to our neighborhood. And, as we all know, the new building will be here before we know it. But just thinking about welcoming in and ushering in kind of a new life to Harlem, and how that changes the dynamics, and whether or not, we're all part of that, but whether or not, we can alter that or change that in any way, I think is really interesting to think about. And I think going back to you, Julie, thinking about that project you did for San Francisco, which is called Hal Eon 1-2, you actually made that in a church a couple blocks down the street, right? I think this is the church here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So can you talk about, if we're talking about thinking about site specificity and public spaces, talk about that process of creating that work, and in Harlem here specifically, thinking about what's happening 3,000 miles away and that history of the landscape in San Francisco.
Well, I guess it was this cyclical type of dynamic about this drive outward and the kind of reverberation back. And then what's happening from that point now, which is building this other kind of infrastructure that is an infrastructure that all of us participate in, willingly or unwillingly. And and then at the same time, this incredible site of the church, which again is owned by developers who are part of they're part of the contributors to this new evolution of this of what this neighborhood is being, but or becoming. But they're also kind of the violent. There's a violent destruction happening within within that development as well, and that's evident in the church. It's cut in half. The second half of the church is destroyed and is now going to be developed into a 24-story condominium tower behind the church. The church itself, one of the ways the developers were able to buy the church and the rectory and the school, which is now Harlem Hebrew, and it's a charter school, a neighborhood charter school right there. And they're building a new development tower on the corner. But part of the reason they were able to do this and buy this huge piece of land for so little was because they made this commitment to create some form of public space. But even that, they're using as a capitalist project, and it's not a cultural space that will do something else for the neighborhood. And it's being rented out, and you have to rent it. And there are problematics with that, but it's interesting because they did choose to keep this building, which wasn't protected in any way. It's not a landmark building. So that just working there is interesting. But also, I had lived on 118th Street. I've been living on 118th Street since 2005. This building was basically closed and then under scaffolding while they restored the facade. And so I was very interested in what was in there, and to then be able to walk down the street and live and work just down the street from where I lived, but then across from the street from the Cecile, which was an historic hotel and venue here in Harlem, and to be creating in there, it was in my investigation. I feel like there's nothing more than just that intense. There's that intense dynamic, and that there's a kind of energy, and there's this reverberation of phantoms and dynamics that can come that I feel that are present. But the reality is the daily aliveness of working and going to the studio and being a part of a neighborhood and a community and being alive right now. So, yeah.
Yeah, and just thinking about the history of specific buildings, and Mabel, in your 2012 book, Negro Building, you trace this historical trajectory of Black museums and exhibitions from the Negro buildings of the World's Fairs in the 19th century to the National Museum of African American History and Culture to the World's Fair, thinking about Chicago and Detroit as very specific places of Black national identity and public space, thinking about how African Americans in this country had to carve out their own spaces for themselves. Can you talk a little bit about this idea of the physicality of these buildings and what that means today?
Yeah, that it's interesting because that book was sort of the product of a really deep archival dive that was very challenging because a lot of the material generated by these expositions were just scattered or just not kept. It was also the outcome of sort of thinking about these questions of public cultural memory through the various sorts of design and art projects that I had done. But part of the reason why the archival project was really challenging was that all of this happened during Jim Crow, and that was spatial policing. So it was very difficult for Black Americans to claim space in any long-term way, to own property, to even be able to rent oftentimes in cities, or even be able to enter into museums. But the expositions were interesting precisely because they were temporary. So there was a sense, well, we could grant permission for 10 days or 6 months, so long as there was no long-term claim to occupying that space. And so, Blacks took advantage of that. And part of the reason nobody had ever looked at it, I think, was precisely because the archive was just scattered and you had to think about it as a temporal project. But then you find out that there were these amazing people that were part of these things. Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, like they saw this as a kind of, they saw the curatorial project as part of whatever it was that they were doing. And I just found all of these amazing artists, Augusta Savage, Jacob Lawrence appeared in a number of them, Charles White, Margaret Burroughs was a key organizer in the fort, like that they really were projects of cultural, cultural exploration, but precisely because they were temporary, made it very, very, very hard to pin down. And the argument of the book is that they lead very much directly to the Black Museum movement in the 60s, and then to establishing institutions like the Studio Museum. But it was precisely this kind of temporary condition, and the temporary use of buildings or the construction of buildings that were then torn down made it very, very difficult to kind of trace in a way. But what was interesting is that you could find the artifacts of paintings or novels, or they existed in other ways, newspaper reports or recordings. So, but not in that kind of specific architecture in a way, not in the monumental architecture that one would expect in, let's say, quote, European Western civilization as a model.
I think American, thinking about the physicality of space and the fact that you work in a field that is liminal, thinking about the internet as a space, thinking about how the internet is constantly changing and things don't have to be permanent and you can take things out and put things back up. So how does this idea of identity formation through the space of the internet, through as an alternative space, a counter public space, like affect your work, and how do you think about it in that way?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think most people, well, I can't speak to everyone, but I feel like there's a certain nature of the internet that allows people to explore their identity in maybe a looser way or something, or kind of find themselves, that I think a lot of people of my generation are exploring and thinking about. And I guess maybe in a similar way, you're able to kind of like form your locality in a more abstract way. Being maybe physically placed in a specific city or location, but thinking of yourself as part of a different network. Someone who doesn't live in New York but still finds themselves online in a community that's primarily people in New York or something like that, for example. Yeah, I don't know. Can you say more, like, for your question?
I'm just moderating. You're supposed to be talking.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, identity formation online, I feel like there's a lot I can say, but
Yeah, and I think what your work is so interesting too, because there's something about the fact that the work is so still in a way, even though the frantic energy of the internet is ever present. There's a stillness to your work that I think is also the absence of sound too. Thinking about the fact that your work is very text-based in a lot of ways, and so it requires this active kind of participation and thinking and concentration to actually grasp what you're trying to get at in the work. And so thinking about that too, about how the internet is a space that is so vast, right? It's incomprehensible, but that what you're actually doing is bringing it all together, and how that, affects both how you're thinking about the work and how also visitors are interacting with your work.
sure. Well, I think I could say along the lines of identity formation and thinking about, I guess, racial politics and how that's kind of like played out in spaces like the internet or immaterial spaces, which is something that I'm trying to address in my current work and also in this work, The Black Critique, and thinking about how these spaces are like primarily developed by white people in places like San Francisco, as you mentioned, and thinking about what it means for an internet or a technology that is more hospitable to Black people or people of color or queer people. So I think I'm trying to use something that is innately like still or like technological, but still trying to like bring in a human or bodily form in maybe a more abstract way, but making a space that's habitable or hospitable to a different kind of like identity. And I guess there is some sound, but the sound, like in this piece, there's sound of the physical structure of the sculpture. I guess it's more not sound like a narration or music or something like that, but sound of the thing functioning itself that puts you in this space of like the machinic or something. But I should probably say more about this piece. So essentially what it is this box with germicidal UV lights in it. It's this still metal case. And the idea of the lights is it's based on an existing kind of technology that's used to cleanse phones or computers. And I was really curious about this idea of like locking these things away in this like case or like coffin like thing, and then using light to kind of like invert them or transform them. And so I was thinking about how computers and phones have this a white interface. Historically, they've kind of transformed from a black interface to a white interface, and thinking of this abstract coffin-like place for these phones or these computers to go and be like transformed into a space where blackness is the default, or blackness is an interface that's like usable and habitable. Yeah.
And I think going back to my original question about sound or absence of sound, I don't know if you wanted to expand on that, but also open it up to both Julie and Mabel, thinking about how sound may or may not kind of influence your practice. I know, Julie, you worked with Jason Miranda a little bit, loosely collaborated with him on your San Francisco project.
Should I say? I mean, I feel like, as you said, the textual does have a prominent space in my work, and I think that's because, I guess similar to a textual or poetic practice, the way you kind of interact with the words and the experience you have when you read the words is already, I guess it has a certain sound or affect to it that I think isn't necessarily there physically or literally, but when you kind of engage with the text, then you're in a space to then feel the different emotions or thoughts that might come with having an interaction with that text. And I think that was specifically important for the Sandy Speaks piece because I didn't want to kind of regurgitate the image of Sandy because it's become this space of like circulating it or showing it or like circulating Black Death imagery, which is like so normative and problematic. But rather than regurgitating that image, I wanted to kind of like use text to let people like feel the weight of the work and of the experience of what happened to her, and to like think about that without having to I guess like undignify her legacy by like reproducing these images over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. Just in another connection or thought with what I'm thinking about with the way that I approach these paintings, but in terms of sound too, I think that sound has always been a component to the way that I work, and I think a lot like of the marks having almost this type that they're almost oral in a particular way that they behave and participate in the paintings and in the landscape. But after I made the paintings, and I should just add, the paintings are made with these various layers of information. So I took these blurred photographs of the American of Bierstadt a Bierstadt painting of Lake Tahoe, for example, or Thomas Church painting of the Andes, and these paintings were then blurred. These images blurred, reduced to reduced to an 8-bit file. And that 8-bit file kind of gave a very digitized noise to the image. And then that image was then recolored with blurred photographs of demonstrations, riots, and protests after many forms of state and people, violence against basically the black body, if you will. Whether it was the London riots in 2012, all the way through Ferguson, Baltimore, and many different forms here in the US. And so these blurred images kind of, I took the color from those blurred images, really it has a relationship to what you're talking about, but to inform the light and color and that moment, to kind of infuse these historic landscapes and these images with this other kind of the context of what was socially happening also at that same time, but then to bring it into this moment, and then to work into that with the mark. And so I think of these spaces very much as these kind of sonic landscapes, and Jason would come and work in the studio while I was working on these, and developed a piece, it kind of side by side from one another. And I think there were definitely ways that there was moments of informing one another, but it wasn't ever as if I was painting him, or he was painting, or he was writing from what he was seeing. There was just this kind of, it was more like working side by side, but. There's some things that after the paintings and after I drew into it and after all the 8-bit that was screened back, printed back into the paintings, I was reading some. There was different performances of and Sasha Kahir was writing about this one performance. Freedom is a constant struggle. And one of the words that he talks about in writing about having seen this is he talks about poetry words are best when language breaks down, and when it breaks down further to become noise. And in a sense, there's something about, and this is coming actually from this very specific experience of how noise, or how the scream, and what I think you can Fred Moten refers to when he's talking in that first paragraph of Aunt Hester's Scream about the Frederick Douglass's aunt, when he talks about that scream as a moment, the first moment of this one, not the first, but this one moment of black performativity, and this form of this other type of language, and this other form of communication, and this kind of tapping into this kind of very intense other form of communication. There's this dynamic that was happening in this description of that of sound in that way that I was very interested in, but I'm interested in within the language of abstraction, and how the abstraction can suggest disembodied parts, how the abstraction can suggest other types of noise, how it can suggest spatial dynamics in space, and how there are these social components and social dynamics embedded within that cacophony.
Yeah, and I think that cacophony is how we think of the city, right? Just all the sounds that you see out on the street, 125th Street, you constantly hear the car horns and the street, the street vendors and the music blaring. And so that becomes a part of the fabric of the city. And I wonder, Mabel, if you want to talk a little bit more about Marching On, or if you want to talk about, I was rereading your essay in Harlem World, and where you talk about Le Corbusier and how he describes Manhattan as a hot jazz in steel and stone. So thinking about how music has been for so long connected with the city, and specifically thinking about Harlem as a source for the music, right, in the 1920s and forward.
Yeah, no, that sort of observation about Le Corbusier was a sense that he was always seeing America as a kind of primitive that he could return to give energy to, what he was seeing as a kind of glacial, frozen Europe at that moment. But again, it's like the black imaginary can kind of fuel the complexity of whiteness in a way. I mean, that's essentially what he's saying. And again, the kind of tapping of the black bodies is exactly labor. But I maybe kind of want to go back to something both America and Julie were talking about, the kind of violence. I'm like, how do you express the violence? I'm working on a project called the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers, with a group of collaborators at University of Virginia in Charlottesville. So where all that crazy went down was like a few hundred yards from this memorial that the university is actually building. I mean, it's an 80-foot diameter circle, and so it was an interesting process to work on that, particularly after the election last year and hearing about what was going on around memorials and monuments. But one of the things that we did in our extensive community outreach before we even designed anything was to talk to people. And one of the things they said, this has to be a joyous monument, but it also has to deal with that pain and that anguish Yvonne has. Like, how do you express that? And at one point in the process, while it was beautifully abstract, in a way, people were like, but wait a minute, we have to see a figure. And one of the ways we realized was, we didn't want to build a monument, but we thought sound could actually embody in a way or give presence to. And the way in which it's designed, it forms a kind of listening. I mean, like it has a, where sound will actually reverberate off. So we realized it could be a kind of performance space for musicians or readings or singing. And that could be a way in which the kind of body could return within the space, that space that is very complicated in terms of how one starts to represent that, I think, that complexity. And I would say that's true, still very much true in the city in terms of, the kind of violence of the police, that has historically always been a part of the Harlem landscape, right? As well as, the street vendors and the hawkers and, so it has, this kind of Janus face, I think, condition around sound in the city.
I don't know if you maybe want to expand on thinking about that project, the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers at UVA, but also the work you did on the African Burial Ground National Monument here in New York. Thinking about cultural memory and collective memory and how that that kind of filters into your practice, each of your practices.
I mean, it's something I've thought a lot about. And again, it kind of goes back to the violences of the archive, the things that aren't in the archive, right? The silences, the violent exclusions that aren't there, and constantly, not knowing your own sort of personal history, right? Because people just didn't talk. They didn't talk about where they came from or how people moved, or so not knowing my whole family history for a long time, or being educated in architecture but literally never seeing your own cultural experience reflected in the work. I always referred to myself as a vampire in architecture because it was just like I wasn't there, and yet I was learning about all these amazing palazzos and villas and all of this stuff about Europe, but never seeing my own experiences. So the memory became a way of kind of excavating and bringing into my work, particularly the work of artists and poets and writers, like finding spaces in that work that I could then translate like into my architecture. So I would just say that the memory, is embedded in place, but I'm also finding it in these kind of creative sources for that then become very potent in terms of how I work or think.
You want to go?
Sure. Yeah, I guess thinking about collective memory along a similar line of like not seeing yourself necessarily represented and trying to like carve out a space for you and like people like you to like have a certain history documented. And I guess like in terms of the internet, as I've been mentioning, the way certain people are using the context of that to like, I guess, document or create new forms of archiving of certain histories. some in terms of like music or religion, or I guess like spaces of habitation and relocation for Black Americans. Let's see, what did I want to mention? I wanted to actually respond to something that Julie had said about I guess cacophony in relation to abstraction, and I think you referenced Fred Moten's use of that term, which I also reference in this piece, and how he kind of intends cacophony to be like a sound that is unharmonious, and harmony being kind of like the hegemony, or like the way we're situated in terms of our government or institution or whatever in like a white space, thinking of cacophony as like a non-space or an outside, and that being like equally valid as like a space of habitation. So for Black people, I think that means like you may appear as unfit for the world that you're within, but that space of habitation that you have is actually like perfectly legitimate, and in another world, like that is harmonious. And that's what I thought of, especially in relation to abstraction, and your paintings, and thinking about the way you're kind of like reframing these historical narratives in abstraction is kind of a way of, I guess, like positing another worldview that like appears abstract, but in another context it actually like makes total sense or something.
Fully legible.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think just to go off on cacophony, thinking about how cacophony is so integral to the city, but also this idea that we order the city too, right? Like we're all frantic, and there's a lot of frenetic energy in the city, but that the spaces of the city are so structured and regulated. So to think about the grid, and Mabel, in your essay, Multicultural City, you describe a short history and ultimately the destruction of the Cabrini green homes on the north side of Chicago, and you describe the urban grid as a kind of normative capitalist space, which, quote, recalibrates land use and value through processes of subtraction, addition, and reorganization. Would you speak more about the grid as this sort of force and its impact on Black spaces, Black bodies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of goes back maybe to the earlier comment about surveying and mapping and cartography, and like the way in which land can be, literally the earth gets abstracted, and then value can literally be extracted out of that, and I think that's been an ongoing process. I mean, Chicago was a perfect example where the development of steel structure, allowed for the replication of the floor. So not only do you get one floor, but you get multiple floors, right? So therefore you can charge 10 times or 100 times, like these days, like what that value is. And that's why I think these become the, kind of monuments to capitalist extraction, essentially. And I do think the kind of grid can allow for that, but it can also be used in other ways. Like I think when I saw that your painting and your background, Julie, in terms of how you start, I'm curious about how you start to think about the grid in how you work in those drawings that you're making, especially that the huge Hal 1 and 2.
Well, I mean, I think it's the grid. I think very much, metaphorically, the grid operates very much how you've talked about it and how you just spoke about it for me, and then the marks. Or this is how I've kind of thought about this in my work for a long time. So if the grid is this Cartesian, modernist, kind of idealistic, kind of capitalist, rigorous kind of dynamic space, and ontologically that space, then the marks and the gesture and the individual capability of making a mark and transformation, and the insistence on existence, the insistence on the individual in that context, which that context is in every effort tries to maybe deny the individual, how those two dynamics interfere, and how maybe the individual can create the schism or the kind of the breakdown sometimes, or how that grid then can be oppressive to the marks, but then how the marks, so there's this constant kind of entropic tango between those dynamics, in a sense, or in in the way that I play with.
So the mark is a kind
forces.
of trace of inhabitation or act or
Maybe,
something.
yeah, like
with
in
it.
that sense, and that these dynamics kind of challenge one another in those ways. But I think that also then when I'm thinking about your work, American, and what and just that landscape that you're negotiating, that same dynamic is at force in a very, very different way. That's so different and so incomprehensible and confusing that it's this. It leads to other thoughts that I'm having a lot right now, but it leads to this haze, which is also something that I'm really interested in, the blurred kind of mirage or of this moment of completely no one feeling secure, completely, even those that are in control of, or those who manage and own massive amounts of that infrastructure, if you will.
Yeah, that's why I wonder, like, net neutrality, like, what is that? Is that the gridding of that virtual
Yeah.
space, actually?
Right. Yeah, I think that, I guess what I'm trying to pose a lot in my work is like a resistance to that grid. As I said, like I guess it's kind of this protocol of feeling obliged to respond to the internet in a certain way. That's not necessarily imposed, at least up till now, legally or anything like that. I mean, obviously there are legal constraints, but I think the way most people interact with online spaces, most of the rules or protocols you follow are more technological or social and cultural. And so with social media, for example, you kind of feel obliged to perform yourself in a certain way. And I think that trying to refuse to produce content in that way or something is a way of, like, I guess, challenging the grid or trying to, like, break out of the grid. And I think along a different line of thought with the work I'm doing now, I'm thinking of, I guess, degridding, so to speak, as kind of like just like making a non-hegemonic like internet space or like a way to access these technologies that is more accessible or, like, I don't know, hospitable to people that it's really not designed for. And, like, what does that even look like? Because it's something, as you said, like, unfathomable. So, like, how can you kind of, like, imagine what that looks like? And I think all of those are ways of, like, challenging this, like, grid, you know?
So you want us to descend into chaos, essentially.
Sure.
One final question for you before we open it up to questions. So this public program came about as the result of the exhibition there on Harlems, which is just outside. And one of the works in that exhibition is Jacob Lawrence's The Architect. And it's a painting that speaks literally to Black architects and the construction of a Black metropolis, but it's also one that speaks to the future. Jacob Lawrence was really interested in thinking about this idea of constructing one's own future. So he became really interested in architects, builders, construction workers, visualizing them as a way to think about the ways that we will build our own future for ourselves. So my final question to you is, how do you each see the future as a concern in your practice and your role in building those futures for yourself, for your viewers, for your readers? Maybe that's a really large question to end on. Mabel?
No, I mean, I was kind of riveted by The Architect, obviously, but it's such a weird painting, actually, because you're looking at it and you think you're actually you're looking at a window, but it's also not clear if you're not looking at the drawing board, right, of the architect, which I assume is also male, right. And so there's a kind of very ambiguous kind of, like, placement of the window in relationship, particularly to there's a T square on the side as well. Yeah, and I'd be really curious what Lawrence thought, because architecture is one of the whitest professions in the country, actually, and no doubt it was super white when he was probably doing that painting. But it's 93% white, and and I think it has to do with its relationship to capital. You have to be able to access people with money and the capital to build, right? I mean, we've got a basically real estate developer in the White House, so that says it all. Yeah, so it's very curious, and yet there's an amazing tradition of Black builders, right? There were always my great my great grandfather was a builder. So there was always this kind of tradition of builders around that weren't necessarily trained architects, but built a lot of stuff around the city. So when I looked at that, I was wondering if that was also a kind of nod to maybe that history or that tradition. But in terms of futurity, I was thinking, like, I'm wondering if we have to think otherwise. Like, we have to think, like there's that trajectory always of the modern, or maybe the meta-modernism, and Julie can respond to that. But is there a parallel or are there other ways of thinking what the next might be that's not wedded to this very kind of weighted notion of modernity? So, and I've been thinking about by just thinking backwards, kind of just backtracking. I'm like now back in the 17th century in my work, maybe to trying to find another, way to think forward.
Yeah, along the lines of futurity, or thinking about what futures I'm like trying to evoke or something. I think, like, ironically, what I might say is that I'm trying to encourage a critical observation of the present, and thinking about how certain power dynamics that have been in play for so long are kind of just going to continue indefinitely. So it's like thinking about the way we're kind of already indoctrinated into certain systems or ways of interacting with these things, and trying to think about how to form alternative futures before it's impossible to do that. So yeah, I think thinking about the internet, it is something that, like, for me, that's very much of my time. Like, I was born around when the internet became a thing, and then it's not futuristic anymore. It's very much normative. So kind of like forcing ourselves to identify it while it's still happening, and then being able to, like, look at it critically and try and, like, think of ways to kind of, like, take control of it or veer it in a certain direction, or, like, engage with it more directly rather than just being like side whatever you hit it. Yeah, just being forced to reckon with it or being encountered by it in ways that we don't have control over. Yeah. Blindsided is what I was trying to say.
Julie, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as artists and people who are engaged in making and being imaginative and creative, we're at the forefront, or we're in this project of thinking about the future and making and contributing and participating. And I think about that constantly with my work, just as you just talked about with your work. Another way that I just want to talk about is that just when you talked about that, I'm involved with two close friends, Paul Pfeiffer and Lawrence Chua, in an organization that we started upstate in the Catskills. And we try to develop, we've been doing this for a long time, when we develop this programming around different ideas that we're all engaged with creatively. And when you asked the question, you sent us this, we had put together this text that described this new program that we're developing right now. And I just thought it related to, so I just wanted to read a couple paragraphs that are related to a lot that's come up in terms of this moment. But the idea of the programming for the next few years, we usually curate the programming around a work of art or an idea. We've in the past done I Like America and America Likes Me around the voice performance, or Holes, this incredible painting. And so this program the next few years will be around the idea of exodus. And so an exodus in the aesthetics and ethics of uncertainty. And so when Moses led the Jews of Egypt out of bondage and into the desert, it was a moment of great upheaval in which time-worn patterns of alienation, subject and solidarity of the house of slavery and iniquitous labor were suddenly interrupted. As the Jews entered no man's land, a new sense of self-determination dawning, away from the security of oppression, the mirages of the desert and their murmurings of uncertainty began to overwhelm them. While the narration of the Exodus often calls to mind the utopic moment of fulfillment upon reaching the Promised Land, the real protagonists of the story are the first generation of ex-slaves who made the imaginative leap to reject bondage and then spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness. The Exodus story, we think, finds new resonance today in a world defined by homelessness, both literal and existential, on an epic scale. Every day we witness scenes of mass dispossession as millions around the globe flee war, natural calamity, ethnic cleansing, and economic hardship. But not even the most privileged can claim, to be secure or fully at home in today's world. For the laws and institutions of civil society have been occupied and rendered ineffective, even meaningless, by the incursions of global capitalism and mass surveillance, the rise of neo-fascism, and the disrupting force of severe climate patterns and game-changing advances in science and technology. In the visual field, the blurring of the virtual and real induced by augmented vision of non-stop live streaming is symptomatic of the cognitive confusion we now take for granted, and we navigate the perverse spaces and temporalities of global capitalism. But while the technologies are new, the state of cognitive confusion or cognitive dissonance is not. The uncanny has been fundamental to the human condition from the very beginning. In the current moment of sensory overload, we are reminded that the Exodus was never simply a geographic journey, it was always ontological, a journey to liberate human consciousness, and this has been ongoing for millennia. Artists, poets, architects, filmmakers, and other creative visionaries have been on the leading edge of the ontological exodus, for they are the inventors of new language, new sensations, and new categories of thought, just as early cinema audiences ran terrified before the projection of the Lumiere film of a train coming down the track. Today's creative visionaries will find the words, images, and forms to bring into focus, which is what you're talking about, the radical new moment of confusion and transformation in which we find ourselves. And so we want to program, one of the ways we're thinking about this future is to program the exodus and the exit from the fantasy of the security into the reality of the mirage, in particular to investigate the legacy of slavery and the politics of race and gender in relation to the current wave of cognitive confusion. At stake is a full appreciation of the agency of the enslaved as an aesthetic and philosophical resource for the journey ahead. And this is a lot what you were just talking about, but also Mabel, what you were talking about and Du Bois talks about in Double Consciousness and stuff. And so that's one way that we're really trying to think about how to take this moment and try, and there's so much at stake and what we can kind of imagine and invent as something else. And I think it's really on all of us to do that.
So do you have programs in place?
Oh yeah, we have artists in residence that that think are leading, this type of project and who have been part of this conversation. I think this is really about building about what happens between all of these different artists, writers, architects, people in that dynamic. So
everyone should check it out.
Well, just yeah, but it was more the idea that I think was coming out of what we're talking about in terms of like these ideas of this moment. Because after how many days has it been? 15? What is the date today? The 15 days, and it feels like how long already in this year in terms of what's going on politically and the mess and the kind of trashiness and it's like it feels like really incomprehensible. Like 2 days ago, people were calling their families saying that their existence would end in 15 minutes, and that was just this is this moment, and yet there's a certain type of imaginative stability in this as well, or possibility.
And I think that's why we're all here, and that's why you're here on this panel, is to think about space, right? Particular moment, and claiming that space, and thinking about what we can do to ensure that we continue to have these spaces, to have these conversations, and to make work.
Yeah.
So thank you all.
Hello? Does anybody have a question? Oh, there we go.
Hi, how's it going? Thank you all for speaking. It's been very interesting, and I've appreciated all your insights. So I have a question. Can you all hear me? I have a question about displacement. We've talked about space a lot today. I've written down my question. So as Harlem transplants yourselves, how do you reconcile your participation in Harlem as an artist with Harlem as your subject against your participation in the displacement of the pre-existing space, environment, and community?
That's a good question. I'll speak a little. Maybe you can speak more as someone who lives here. But yeah, my interaction with Harlem, I guess like professionally, is not so extensive. But I guess my hope is that whatever work I am doing in this space can somehow speak to the concerns that you're bringing up in a way that might be more productive, like producing thought around these ideas or making people aware of certain aspects of displacement, like more so than the actual act of me being here itself. Like I can somehow make more action or produce more thought around that, or affect other people to kind of like think about that as well as they inhabit Harlem, more so than my presence being here and also being someone displacing other people.
When I came to this neighborhood, it was really interesting because Harlem, I feel like it's maybe in the last 5 years that you've really seen an intense 5, maybe 10, but really the last 5 where you've seen this kind of dramatic kind of form of displacement that's happened. When I came here, like I said, there were huge lots of urban farms, essentially, where no one was living there, and where you had massive numbers of brownstones that were just boarded up, that people didn't live in, and that owners were holding on to for whatever reason. And so it was a very different dynamic that was happening in Harlem. Harlem was always kind of a prospective kind of neighborhood at that time. It was like, it's about to happen. There was that Bill Clinton moved into the neighborhood, and there was supposed to be this huge kind of rush, and there wasn't. It didn't happen at that same pace. And it was really because of the history of the neighborhood that you didn't have that kind of form of high-speed gentrification that you have now here. So it's a very kind of it's very interesting, I think, to look back at how what happened in Brooklyn happened very differently here in Harlem, and what took place in neighborhoods and historic neighborhoods in Brooklyn happened in a very different way and at a very different pace here in Harlem, from my experience. Then at the same time, you have this thing that's happening in Harlem, which a lot of these buildings, I mean, this is not just my personal, but a lot of the new buildings that have been built that I'm complaining about are actually important in terms of how you can create multi-family homes, that you can have cross-sectional type of economic diversity in a neighborhood. If you want to really develop a neighborhood or a place and want to be able to not just have it be quaint and kind of look nostalgic and romantic and look like many areas of San Francisco look, but a lot of the row houses look on some of the streets here. You need multifamily homes. You need these kind of high-rise condos that are not so beautiful, that are made kind of they could be, I think they could be a lot more beautiful, but they made with a different type of intention. But you need low end. You need to have not low end, but low cost housing in this way. That has to exist, and you have to have a lot of housing in order to make it really a diverse community. So there are these weird dynamics happening in this neighborhood. As somebody who lives here, and I think this happens wherever you live, I think that there's this idea that any neighborhood could be static is just ill-conceived. What Harlem has been, what it was, has gone through millions of different transformations, and we're all agents of our time and of our moment, and if we're constructive, engaged agents of that moment, we are part of the development and change and evolution of a place, and that's part of a place being alive. And there can be a certain type of mindfulness and intention with how we don't just erase or eliminate a history. And I think that these institutions and what the Studio Museum has been, because of the gift of the artist that created it, but under the incredible leadership that it's had and will continue to have, and the contribution of what David Adjaye will build here, and what this will eventually evolve into, are maintaining something else, not just what has evolved from Petco and McDonald's and these other kind of corporations taking over,
Yeah, I mean, I would just simply say you really have to look historically at, how redevelopment and gentrification, actually work. I feel like there just needs to be a global redistribution of wealth, because that's at the root of it. But I also, I mean, that really is. It's at the root of, but I also think there is a kind of structural inequality around who, like Michel Foucault would say, like, the state makes live or let die. And often it's black and brown bodies that are going to be let die, and it's white bodies that are basically the system makes life. And you see that's how the income. And so if you ever look at, go online and look at the redlining maps, right? You could see just because a black body lived in that building is worth less. The bank won't give it money. But as soon as a white body moves, all of a sudden it has value. And that really impacts, like, the accumulation of wealth and what you can do and who can move where. And so these are structural and historical, and I think there really needs to be radical change in order to transform that. So that's a quick answer to your provocative question.
Yeah.
Thank you for this very exceptional conversation. I would love to hear each of you talk about how we bring spaces where people are incarcerated into the conversation as well. Thinking about the little Harlems that are behind bars. We all know about the concentration of people from certain neighborhoods in prisons. And so how do you think both about the relationship, how do we think about Harlem when it moves across this ground and that space back and forth? And how also, in thinking about incarcerated spaces, does that give you more space to talk about human beings and the conditions in which they move every day?
I'll try to. I think that's a really important question to ask, precisely, because with the prison industrial complex, the new Jim Crow, we know again the history of what that means, and absolutely right. It's embedded in the material conditions as to where resources are allocated and what that means for someone's life's chances, and so there's a kind of mechanism that are producing all of these things, and there's profit to be gained, as we know, through incarceration, and so somehow, trying to find spaces that make people aware, of these things, and also trying to get people to think differently about the criminal justice system, and also working with people within those systems. Those spaces, actually, they have to exist, and they have to, they can't be abstract, but they have to be located somewhere. And I think it's really important to find, and have those spaces as part of any kind of community. And it can't be, because what has always happened is those get marginalized and off to the side, and I think they have to be part of, any transformation of any kind of community.
Yeah, for me, I feel like also it's very evident in the public school systems right here in this community, and these are early. Many of them feel like early incarceration centers in terms of how those schools are the infrastructure, but then how they're run, and there are a lot of projects right in this area that are dealing with that are really valuable projects that are dealing with, like, re-entry programs and education programs for young kids who are still in high school who were incarcerated or have been incarcerated when they were young. Since New York is one of two, I think, New York and Virginia or South Carolina, one of the two that where if you're over 16, you're incarcerated with adults, and so high school students and have this reality where if they're accused of anything, and they can spend time in jail, especially if they can't afford bail in this community, and there are ways to get involved, and that I've tried to get involved in terms of how you can help in terms of re-education, re-entry with education programs, but also then with bail fund kind of resources. But it's a huge. That's like the terror the kind of violence and terrorism that kind of exists in this neighborhood in a really serious way, and a lot of new residents want to further contribute to the kind of problematics that exist in this, whether they're calling on people hanging out having barbecues in the park, or people who are hanging out where they've been hanging out for years to get together, and you have this kind of the contribution to a violent dynamic without even knowing that they're contributing to this very kind of like distorted kind of system. So I don't know. It's a really, really good question in the piece. I can't remember his name now. Yeah, Cheryl Rowland's piece, which is phenomenal and just shakes me, gave me goosebumps before coming in here with the orange tape of the scale of his cell. That performance is incredible, and I feel like this is really like our issue, one of our really most important issues. So I'm glad you raised it. But
yeah, I do feel at this particular moment it is becoming a national conversation, like at a higher degree than ever before, because of certain conversations that have become public. I guess, for example, like 13th kind of like was a really entry level way to access the conversation on incarceration and the prison industrial complex. And I think, as you mentioned, one of the more sinister aspects is the way people can be arrested and put in prison before having a trial for indefinitely. And I think as far as, I guess, how arts can kind of like interact with this or disrupt it is through certain community programs or state-funded programs that are trying to directly engage with incarcerated people. I recently was able to do a program where I spoke to some students that had been arrested, and that was like a way of someone who's in my field who maybe doesn't regularly interact with someone who's been in arrested or incarcerated, but kind of like I don't know, opening up this dialogue and kind of like bridging this gap that otherwise might exist between like certain positions or certain fields or certain locations or whatnot. And I think that a lot of people are very much interested in developing more programs like that.
We have time for one more question. Oh, there you are.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. I have a quick question. So I'm really interested in Afrofuturism as a way to envision a better world for Blackness and centering Black bodies. But as you said, like with architecture, how it's still one of the most white professions, what are some of the kind of practical tools that you think we need to enact to shift that over? Because I think with so many different disciplines represented on stage, thinking about Afrofuturism and the imaginary is what we should be doing, but like what are some of these like practical ways that you think we can start to shift these professions so that Blackness does become centered? And that's not saying that we need to exclude white folks from these institutions, but what does it look like to have a world where Blackness is centered and white folks are a part of it, but they're not bringing patriarchy or heteronormativity, et cetera? I think it's mainly more towards you about architecture because you made that statement about the current industry.
Yeah, no, it's kind of it's through the work you do. It's I'm fortunate that I teach, and I am co-director of something called Global Africa Lab with a colleague, Mario Gooden. And we've done a series of workshops around the world, studios that have been taught around Brazil and Johannesburg and Cape Town and Dakar and Bahia will be one in the spring. And, we did a workshop with a group of South African students, and really, different range of students. And we brought some of our students who were Black, white, Asian, straight. I mean, it was just a complete mix. And they were working and looking at street traders in downtown Johannesburg on Bree Street. If anyone knows Johannesburg, people would think we were crazy to have them work in that. But it was amazing, the collaborations that they did, the work they did, the things that they discovered, but also how the work helped some of the traders sort of think through like what they're imagined, like why were they in the city, how are they working, what's their spaces like, the techniques, and I think it just brought a completely different perspective to our students, to the South African students, to everyone about, kind of like what can be cracked open if you actually start to look at other creative practices that aren't typically the kind of the normative ones. So, I would say that's one example. We we sort of talk about it as the Afro-imaginary, to kind of even drop the notion of like future, the future as a, as a kind of modern trope, but to kind of think about like what are kind of creative practices that are happening that aren't necessarily recognized in traditional ways.
I would say an easy answer is like learning to code. I think for young people of color is like really important because all the resources are like available, and you don't necessarily need a degree to get a good job. You just have to be good at it. So I would say like just as you're learning English or whatever else you're learning in school, you can also like start to learn how to code, and by the time you're of an age to get a job, like that's going to be really like on the forefront of what we need people to be doing.
And I would like to remind you that Africa and Ethiopia, where I'm from, is some of the most paternalistic, patriotic. I mean, the patriarchy is very much alive, and so I think like an imaginative is also about how to imagine with something with a spin where you imagine completely new language and a new kind of dynamic completely.
Peekaboo. Hi. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for that conversation, Mabel, American, Julie, and Connie.